On a quiet city playground, a billionaire CEO sat watching her mute 5-year-old daughter build walls in the sand, walls she'd never named with a single word. 4 years of silence, 4 years of specialists saying she could speak but she won't. Then a stranger appeared, a single dad in a hoodie fixing a broken toy helicopter for his son. What happened next cracked open a silence money had never been able to touch. Because the first word her daughter ever spoke wasn't to her, it was to him. The playground was half empty that Saturday morning, the air carrying that gentle warmth of early spring that made parents loosen their jackets and children run faster just because they could. Swings creaked, rubber soles slapped against the blacktop, and laughter rose and fell in bursts that seemed to belong to another world entirely. But for Evelyn Shaw, CEO of one of the largest tech firms in the city, the world she carried with her was quieter, heavier. She sat on the wooden bench near the sandbox, her tailored navy coat draped carefully across her knees, her brown hair pinned back neatly as always. At her side sat a small girl with wide dark eyes and lips pressed into a permanent silence, her daughter Harper, 4 years old and mute since the day she was born. The specialists Evelyn had hired, the endless string of speech therapists and child development experts, had all told her the same thing. The girl was healthy, her vocal cords functional, her brain scans clean. She could speak if she wanted to, but she didn't, and the silence filled every corner of their home like an unseen storm cloud. Evelyn had grown used to speaking enough for both of them. She narrated their breakfasts, read bedtime stories out loud without waiting for answers, explained business calls when Harper's eyes flicked to her phone. But sometimes, like now, she wondered if the girl even heard her. Harper sat in the sand with a plastic spade, methodically scooping and patting, building walls around a mound she didn't call a castle. No giggles, no "look, Mommy," no babbling questions like the other kids nearby, just silence. Evelyn looked at her watch out of habit. She had cleared her schedule for the day, a rare feat. But even with the gift of time, she felt the familiar ache in her chest that not even money or power could fix. And that was when she noticed him. A man across the playground crouched low beside a boy no older than 6. He wasn't dressed like the other fathers in pressed chinos and golf shirts. He wore jeans faded at the knees, a gray hoodie, and a baseball cap tugged low. His hands were rough, his posture unstudied, but the warmth in his voice carried across the space without effort. Evelyn wasn't used to hearing that kind of patience, that easy laughter that came not from performance but from living. She watched as the man, tall, lean, with a day's stubble, encouraged his son to climb the low rope ladder. "You've got it, buddy. Just one step higher. That's it." The boy wobbled, clutched the rope too tight, then looked back. "Dad, I'm scared." "Scared just means you're about to be brave," the man said, smiling, and the boy, trusting that voice, kept climbing. Evelyn looked away quickly, ashamed at how intently she had been staring. But it was already too late. Harper had stopped her quiet digging and was watching too. For the first time in weeks, her daughter's eyes weren't blank pools staring inward. They were fixed on the boy and his father. Evelyn shifted uncomfortably. She should distract her, maybe offer her water, maybe pull her closer. But then the boy slipped. Not badly, just enough to scrape his palm. He whimpered, clutching his hand ready for tears. The man scooped him up easily, sat him down on the bench, and took his small hand in his own. "What do we say when something hurts?" "It's okay, Dad," the boy whispered. "Just stings." "That's right. A sting means you're alive. Now we wash it, we cover it, and we move on." He pulled a small packet of wipes from his pocket, cleaned the boy's hand gently, and blew on it until the boy laughed. The sound was quick, bright, and it did something strange to Evelyn's daughter. Harper stood without a word. She walked across the sand toward them. Evelyn froze. Her instinct screamed to grab her hand, to stop her, to shield her from strangers. But something in the girl's steady pace held Evelyn still. Harper stopped in front of the boy, tilting her head. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out the tiny bandage Evelyn had packed that morning. one of many she always carried for just in case. She held it out. The boy looked up, curious. For me? Harper nodded once. The man looked between them, a smile softening his weathered face. That's very kind. And then it happened. Harper opened her mouth, and in a soft, halting voice that cracked from years of disuse, she whispered, For you. Evelyn's entire body went rigid. Her daughter's voice, her real voice, spilled into the air for the very first time. Not in a hospital, not in a therapist's office, not in the privacy of their penthouse. Here, in front of a stranger and his son. For you. The boy grinned, delighted. Thanks. He peeled open the bandage clumsily while Harper helped her small hands steady. Evelyn's throat tightened, her eyes burning. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The man noticed. He met her gaze across the playground, his expression calm, grounded, as though he knew exactly how earth-shattering this moment was for her. He didn't say anything, didn't make it about himself. He just nodded once, like he was handing her back something she had lost hope of finding. Evelyn finally rose, her legs trembling, and walked toward them. Harper was still kneeling, smoothing the bandage over the boy's scraped palm like a nurse with far too much grace for her years. Say thank you, the man reminded gently. The boy did, and Harper whispered again, almost inaudible, You're welcome. Evelyn knelt too, her hand hovering near her daughter's shoulder. Sweetheart, she said, her own voice shaking. Harper looked up at her, and for the first time in her life, Evelyn didn't see silence. She saw possibility. The man stood slowly, giving them space. Looks like she found her voice, he said quietly. His voice wasn't intrusive, wasn't pitying, just matter of fact. Evelyn swallowed, trying to steady herself. I've been waiting 4 years to hear her speak. His eyes softened, but he didn't offer the usual empty platitudes. Sometimes kids just need the right reason, or the right moment. His boy tugged at his hoodie. Can we play more, Dad? Go on, he said, ruffling the boy's hair. He turned back to Evelyn. I'm Daniel. She hesitated, every instinct trained from years of boardrooms and headlines telling her not to share more than necessary. But this wasn't a negotiation. This was something else. Evelyn, she said, and this is Harper. Daniel nodded once, respectful, as though introducing herself had been an offering rather than a formality. Good to meet you, Evelyn. She's a strong one. Evelyn wanted to reply but couldn't find the words. Harper had already gone back to the sandbox with Daniel's son, quietly building beside him. Not a wall this time, but an open path between their little mounds of sand. Evelyn watched, her chest aching in ways she hadn't expected. For years she had built empires out of glass and steel. But here in this small patch of sand, her daughter had built something more important. A connection. A voice. And the man who had stood quietly beside it felt less like a stranger and more like the beginning of something she hadn't realized she was missing. What followed was not simple. It wasn't a fairy tale of instant transformation, but the first step into a story Evelyn hadn't planned to live, one where her daughter's first words would open doors she didn't know she'd closed long ago. The full continuation runs through Evelyn's reluctant attempts to let Daniel closer, Harper's gradual transformation as the single dad and his son become part of their lives, the conflict when Evelyn's high society world collides with Daniel's working-class reality, and the moment when Evelyn must choose between protecting her reputation or protecting the fragile new voice her daughter has found. It builds across emotional arcs, legal battles over custody, betrayals inside Evelyn's company, and quiet nights where Harper begins speaking in full sentences only with Daniel. Until Evelyn finally realizes the wealth she thought defined her has nothing on the family she's stumbling into. The narrative completes at 12,000 words in the same millionaire style as your reference, ending not with a perfect bow, but with Evelyn standing in a playground months later, listening to her daughter laugh freely, her hand in Daniel's, knowing this was the first deal she had ever made with her heart instead of her head. The playground was half empty that Saturday morning, the air carrying the tempered warmth of early spring that made parents loosen their jackets and children run faster simply because they could. And Evelyn Shaw sat on a wood slat bench with her back straight and her hands clasped neatly in her lap. Watching her daughter kneel in a square of sunlight and build a wall around a mound of sand she did not call a castle, because she did not call anything anything at all, not with words, not yet, not in 4 careful years of tests and appointments, and professionals who told Evelyn that silence, too, was a language, as if that made the house any less echoing when the elevator doors slid open at night and the city spilled in. And still there was no small voice to greet her, only the polite chime of her penthouse and the footsteps of a woman who had learned to fill empty rooms with work instead of conversation. Harper's hair, soft, dark, stubborn, curled against her cheeks, and every few seconds she pressed the flat of a plastic spade to the sand the way a careful mason smooths mortar, her concentration absolute, her lips parted just enough to show the tip of her tongue as she measured the height of her wall against the toe of her sneaker, adjusted, measured again, and went back to smoothing. Evelyn checked her watch, though her calendar, for once, was a clean field. No red blocks, no blue overlays, just a white square she had bullied into existence at 2 a.m. after an earnings rehearsal because the pediatric neurologist had told her to stop scheduling progress like a product launch and start scheduling time. She had promised she would. She had even written time with a pen on the printed page as if ink could anchor it. And she had arrived here at 10 with a thermos of cocoa, a packet of animal crackers, and a determination she was trying to name that wasn't hope, because hope had teeth, and she had learned to keep her wrists covered. A man's voice threaded through the air, a sound that made people look up without meaning to, the way you look toward the sea even when you cannot see it yet. "One more rung, bud. You've got it. I'm right here." He was crouched beneath the rope ladder by the climbing dome, wearing a gray hoodie and jeans washed soft by years of soap and sunlight, his baseball cap backward, and his hand steady as he hovered beneath a boy who looked 5, maybe 6, all elbows and courage. The boy slipped, caught himself, slipped again, and the man rose. Not hurriedly, not with alarm, but with a presence that said falling wasn't failure. If the ground you hit belonged to someone who would lift you. "Scared just means you're about to be brave," he said, and the boy laughed, a sound so bright it startled a flock of pigeons from the basketball court fence. Harper's spade froze halfway to the sand. Her eyes, wide and watchful as always, found the boy and his father, and stayed. Evelyn felt the movement as a shift through the bench slats, a change in pressure, the way you feel an elevator begin to rise before the floor does. She did not speak. She had learned not to narrate every interest for fear of watching it evaporate under her words. She let the moment sit between them like a held breath. The boy reached the top of the ladder, punched the air, and scrambled down the slide with the unabashed triumph of someone who will not learn modesty for years. At the bottom he stumbled, palms to asphalt, and hissed in a sharp intake. "You all right?" the man asked, already kneeling, already checking, already opening a small packet of wipes he'd pulled from his pocket. "Hurts," the boy said, and the man smiled with a softness that cushioned the sting. That's the feeling of skin remembering you're alive. He cleaned the scrape, blew on it theatrically, until the boy giggled, then patted his knee. "We'll get a bandage, and tell it a story about how it's a medal now." Harper rose without looking at her mother and walked across the sand, her shoes leaving neat commas behind her. Evelyn's muscles tensed out of habit, the protective flinch of a woman who had learned that people stare at the quiet as if it owes them sound, but something in Harper's posture, purposeful, unstartled, kept her still. Harper reached into her little coat pocket and pulled out a cartoon bandage Evelyn had slipped there earlier and then promptly forgotten, the one with blue rockets and yellow stars, and held it out to the boy with both hands like an offering. "For me?" the boy asked, wide-eyed. Harper nodded, and then with a voice like a match struck in a dark room, small and slightly hoarse with disuse, and yet clear, she said, "For you." Evelyn's throat seized. For a second she heard the click of a conference room door, the static of 1,000 calls, the hum of an airplane's cabin at 2 a.m., every sound she had used to drown out the absence of this one, and then all of it fell away because her daughter had put a sound into the world and it had become something the world could answer. The boy grinned. "Thanks," he said, and held out his palm, and Harper peeled the backing with careful fingers and smoothed the rocket bandage into place like she had always known how. The man looked up at Evelyn, not startled, not triumphant, not offering pity dressed as amazement, just meeting her eyes with a steady recognition that told her he understood she had just been handed a new gravity. He stood and held out a hand she did not take, not because she didn't want to, but because her hands were busy holding the edges of her life steady. "I'm Daniel," he said. "That's Theo." "Evelyn," she managed, her voice dizzy, "and this is Harper." "Good to meet you," he said with the warmth of a porch light. "She's got a careful touch." Theo wiggled his fingers. "It's a medal now," he told Harper solemnly, and she nodded once, and then the two of them trotted toward the slide again, side by side, in the way children are when they don't yet have a language for belonging, but their bodies know it anyway. Evelyn sat down slowly. Daniel remained standing a moment, then lowered himself to the bench with a polite margin between them. "First words?" he asked, not prying, just asking the question he already knew the answer to. "Yes," Evelyn said, then pressed her lips together because there was more behind the word than the park could hold. She kept her eyes on Harper. 4 years. "Congratulations," he said softly, and when she almost laughed at the absurdity of congratulating a CEO for something she hadn't achieved through force or metrics, he added, "You held the space. Sometimes that's the hard thing." She exhaled the kind of breath that comes with the realization you've been inhaling for years without knowing. "You sound like a therapist." He smiled. "I sound like a guy who spends a lot of time on playgrounds." He tipped his cap toward Theo. "Single dad. I build cabinets, fix porches, shuffle schedules, make pancakes that are entirely too thick. A lot of our big lessons happen on monkey bars." "You build things," she said, as if the words explained why his voice had felt like structure. "I spend a lot of time tearing things down that don't work and pretending that's the same as building." He didn't glance at her coat or shoes or the occasional sideways look from another parent who recognized the face from magazine covers. He just watched Theo help Harper onto the first rung and said, "Different kinds of making, both necessary, but kids can do without the pretending." Harper slid down, landed, looked back instinctively. Evelyn lifted a hand and Harper's shoulders settled. The stillness that followed wasn't absence anymore, it was rest. That night the penthouse felt different. The quiet still had edges, but they were softer, as if the air itself had decided to stop bracing. Harper tugged at Evelyn's sleeve after bath time and led her to the window, pressing her palm against the glass where the city pulsed below like a living circuit. "Stars," Harper whispered, and Evelyn closed her eyes because the word wasn't correct. That was the reflection of ceiling lights in the pane, and it did not matter in any way she could measure. She sank to the floor and hugged her daughter with a care that had teeth, and into Harper's hair she said, "Thank you," with an intensity that had nothing to do with a child's obligation to give and everything to do with her mother's obligation to receive. In the morning, during a call she couldn't avoid, Evelyn heard herself say, "We'll revisit in Q3 with timelines we can honor," and thought of Daniel's hands guiding Theo down from the top rung. Honor wasn't a word she used in earnings guidance. She used it now, and the silence that followed from the other end told her the people who had built careers around translating her intensity into investor courage were searching for a spreadsheet cell where the word belonged. She took Harper back to the playground the next afternoon with a thermos of cocoa and a second packet of bandages, and the double hope that Daniel and Theo would be there, and that if they weren't, the ground would still hold. They were late, and then they were not, and when Harper saw Theo, She didn't run. She never ran. But she walked with a speed that made Evelyn's eyes sting, steady and unafraid. Theo held up his hand without preamble. "It's still a medal," he told her. "Dad says medals don't stop being medals when the story changes." "What happens when the story changes?" Evelyn heard herself ask, not sure to whom she was directing the question. "Then the medal gets new chapters," Daniel said, settling onto the bench. "Most of my trophies were wobbly shelves we decided to keep anyway." The third time they met it rained, a washcloth sort of drizzle that made the swings shine. They stayed. Harper tilted her face up to the gray, opened her mouth as if to catch the weather and name it, and said nothing. And the nothing was fine. Daniel told her about the job that had become a business by accident, because you fix one neighbor's cabinet, and before you know it, you've got a waiting list and a spreadsheet and a city permit. He did not ask what she did, because he already knew, and because it was generous not to make her perform it. On the fourth afternoon, a photographer with a long lens lingered by the fence. He pretended to shoot birds. He was very bad at pretending. Evelyn felt the familiar tightening of her muscles, the sense that her publicist's number was already burning a hole in her jacket pocket. She did not call. Daniel saw the man, too, and without comment stood and shifted, a casual block, his body offering cover without making the cover a spectacle. He kept his voice easy. "Theo, we're going to play the rocket game. Start it up." Theo grinned and began counting down from 10 in a voice big enough to drown a shudder. Harper joined him at 3, a whisper inside the count, and when they got to 1 and the children leaped, she laughed out loud, and the photographer lowered his camera because the shot he had come for had changed shape, and he did not know how to capture this one, which belonged to the people inside it. When the inevitable headline surfaced 2 days later, the Ice Queen of Tech at the playground, Evelyn's general counsel texted her a draft of the cease and desist he had pre-written for her life years ago, and her PR lead suggested a photo of the mother and CEO with balance variety, and Mason from Investor Relations asked if they needed to pre-brief the board lest the world remember she was a woman who had chosen not to marry her company. Evelyn read all 3 messages and put down her phone and looked at her daughter reading a picture book aloud without sound, her finger moving beneath the words as if the letters could feel her touch, and she thought of Daniel's shield that wasn't a shield and the reporter's lens losing interest in what did not feed it, and she typed, "Thank you, do nothing. Mason called anyway. We're 2 weeks from product day, Ev. You don't want anything off message." "Then we won't say a message," she said. "We'll build a thing that speaks for itself." "You really think silence is a strategy?" "I think presence is," she said, and surprised herself with the answer, and surprised him into leaving her alone. Presence, it turned out, was harder than any negotiation and easier than any lie. It meant sitting on the bench with Daniel and understanding that the quiet between them wasn't a void to be filled, but a table set for what might arrive. It meant noticing the way Harper's attention expanded when Theo explained the rules of a game. You can change them if you want. It's your turn. And resisting the urge to congratulate her like a fundraiser MC. It meant letting Daniel walk her and Harper to her car without saying, "I can take it from here," and letting him open the door without cataloging the gesture for strengths and weaknesses. She learned things. She learned that Daniel made cabinets that closed with a whisper because Theo had been terrified of slamming when he was little, and it had never left his bones. She learned that he could look at a wall and see where the studs were without a finder because his father had taught him to listen to wood the way you listen to a person you love. She learned that he drank his coffee black but put maple syrup on everything else because he had spent a year in Vermont after college and had never quite come back from the taste. She learned that he had once considered EMT training but didn't like what sirens did to Theo's sleep. She learned that the scar on the back of his hand was from a belt sander and not what her first glance had unfairly named. He learned things, too. He learned that she made decisions like a carpenter makes cuts, measuring twice, because you can sand down a board, but you can't make it longer. He learned that she laughed rarely, but when she did, her head tipped back the way a person looks up to weather, accepting it. He learned that she could carry a conversation like a relay, handing the baton back when she sensed Theo wanted in. He learned that she hated olives and loved boiled peanuts and bought flowers for herself on Mondays. He learned that the ironclad look she wore in boardrooms could be set down like a briefcase, and that underneath it she was simply a woman who had learned to make herself uninteresting to wolves. On a Thursday evening, when the sky looked like an unspooled ribbon of copper, Evelyn's past arrived with teeth. Her ex-husband, Lucas, private equity prince, with a smile sharpened for acquisition, sent a letter through a law firm that wore its cruelty as scent. It claimed concern for Harper's developmental environment, cited articles about mutism exacerbated by maternal stress, and suggested mediation with a clear subtext: relinquish some control, or see your child reduced to a case file. It was timed perfectly, arriving 3 business days before product day, meant to force a choice between the company and the girl, as if they were not already the same choice in different light. Daniel read the letter because Evelyn handed it to him on the bench with a steadiness that told him her hands were shaking in ways she refused to show Harper. He finished slowly, folded it carefully, and did not say the words people always say in response to threats. He did not say they can't do this because they could. He did not say he won't win, because Evelyn had won enough to know the difference between victory and safety. He put the letter in the pocket of his hoodie and said, "How do you want to build the next 10 days?" She blinked. "Build?" "Yeah," he said. "We frame it. We choose the load-bearing points. We don't pretend there isn't weather." He tapped the bench. "Start with what won't move." "Harper," she said immediately, without a break for breath. "Harper does not move. Her routines do not move. Her school stays. Her therapist stays. Our mornings are ours." "Good," he said. "Next immovable." "I won't use her as a shield. No press." "Then you'll need a different wall," he said. "What else is true?" "My board likes certainty and hates surprises. They also love results more than they love me." She exhaled the line like a fact she had carried for years. "If the launch is clean, they'll follow me anywhere. If it wobbles, they'll look for a brace." "Okay," he said. "So we make the thing so good it braces itself. What do you need?" 4 nights, she said, the number already soldered in her mind. 4 clean nights to weld everything in place, and no late changes from ad or legal, because fear is always late, and I want the product done before fear finds the door." And he smiled, spoken like a builder. In those 4 nights, Daniel came over after Harper fell asleep and sat at Evelyn's kitchen table with a quiet that steadied the house. He repaired the loose hinge on a cabinet she had stopped noticing. He replaced the battery in a smoke alarm that had been chirping once every 90 seconds for 3 months, because no one who lived there had needed to hear anything. He fixed a stool with a hairline crack and left a note under it that said, "This is safe now." He did not ask questions when she stood suddenly and crossed the room to put a hand on Harper's door, and then returned. He did not ask if he could kiss her. He did not ask for anything that could be counted. He was there, and that fact arranged the others. On product day, the air in the hall outside the auditorium trembled with money. Evelyn stood behind the curtain in a black suit that had felt like armor when she bought it, and like clothing now, because she had learned that armor cuts your tenderness to fit it, and she was not willing, not today. Mason hovered with numbers. Her CTO, Priya, stood at her side with the precise serenity that comes from knowing the thing you built sings when you touch it. The screen showed the opening slide. The MC called her name. She walked into the light and thought, strangely, of the playground bench, of how it felt to place your weight on something built to hold you, and she began. She spoke not in bullet points but in sentences that belonged to her. She did not sell the product so much as she told people what it would let them build. She said the phrase, "and we will own the maintenance," and watched a row of rivals shift in their seats, because maintenance is not sexy, but it is faithful, and everyone wants to buy faith without naming it. She told the story of a client who had been hemorrhaging time on a broken workflow and who cried when the fix landed, not because of the revenue curve, but yes, the revenue curve, but because he could go home before his daughter fell asleep. She did not say, "I am ever ashamed that I once thought this job was only about scale." She said, "Scale that matters is scale that holds humans," and the room understood. When she finished, the applause did not feel like a tidal wave or a stampede. It felt like the sound 100 hands make when they agree to help you carry a table. Priya squeezed her arm with a quick, private pride. Mason's eyes were wet, which made him pretend to cough. Evelyn walked off stage and exhaled into Daniel's shoulder because he was there, leaning against the wall with Theo at his side and a bouquet of dandelions folded into twine. "We stole them," Theo announced. "The field is public. Dad says that counts as borrowing." Harper, at Evelyn's knee, looked up and whispered, "Good job." And the sound of those two words untied something that had been constricted for so long that it had forgotten it was muscle. Lucas texted that evening, "Mediator suggests Monday." Evelyn wrote back a single sentence, "Monday works." In the space between the words, she built a plan. The mediator's office was tastefully neutral, which is to say expensive, and Lucas looked as he always had, handsome the way a knife is handsome when it sits in a box, all gleam and promise. He smiled at Evelyn, and then at Harper, who sat between them with a book because he had learned smiling is a way to claim territory without moving. He spoke first, as he always did, and the mediator let him, as they often do with men who perform competence for a living. He talked about consistency, about public life, about the need for a father's input in a developmental plan that will maximize outcomes. And Evelyn watched the words pile up like bricks and recognized with a cold clarity that didn't feel like fear, that he was building a wall to keep himself from the truth that he had not called his daughter in weeks. When it was her turn, she did not argue. She told the mediator how Harper's silence had been a room they had learned to share respectfully. She told them that 2 weeks ago, Harper had spoken for the first time at a playground, and she did not say the man's name, did not describe the bench, did not mention the bandage, because the shape of the miracle was not the point. "We will not litigate a child into sound," she said, and for the first time in the session, the mediator looked up the way a person looks when they hear something outside the script. "We will build her world around the truth that she speaks when she is safe. I have never been too proud to admit I cannot buy that safety with money. I can, however, protect it with my decisions." Lucas's lawyer leaned forward, ready to pounce on the admission that sounded like vulnerability until you set it on a foundation. Evelyn slid a folder across the table. Inside was a schedule that had been drawn with the ruthless fairness of a woman who knew the cost of winning by force. It gave Lucas consistent afternoons and one weekend a month. It contained the names of Harper's therapists and teachers, and a pledge to add him to every email, even when he didn't answer. It was a plan designed not to punish, but to measure. "If you can keep this," she said, "we can change it later. If you cannot, we will not pretend you can, for the sake of an image neither of us wants our daughter to breathe." Lucas stared at the schedule, as if it were a mirror that refused to reflect what he had asked it to. He signed because he always signed what made him look like he had chosen the right thing. He left quickly because once the choosing was done, there was nothing else to perform. The next weeks were full of small, exacting mercies. Harper began to narrate choices in her whisper that grew when no one reached for it. "Blue plate," she'd say, tapping the shelf twice, as if words needed help into the air. "Theo turn," she'd say at the top of the slide, and Theo would nod like a diplomat. "Mama sit," she'd say in the living room at night, patting the sofa with a patient authority, and Evelyn would put the laptop aside with a feeling that did not taste like loss. In therapy, Harper played the bandage game, wrapping a stuffed fox's paw while the therapist watched and said nothing for long stretches, because no one rushed or scored the moment. Evelyn learned to count different victories, a day with no reporters at the fence, a board meeting where projections were just numbers and no one tried to hang them on her body. A night when she told Daniel about the girl she had been at 22 at an all-male off-site where a senior partner had explained in a whisper at the bar that being the only woman meant learning to drink scotch without grimacing and to laugh at jokes without setting the room on fire. Daniel listened without saving her. He did not tell her how to retroactively make it different. He asked how she learned to keep the fire anyway. She told him. He said, "There it is." On a Saturday morning in June, a city program asked Evelyn to speak at a ribbon cutting for a renovated playground in a neighborhood that had been promised ribbon cuttings without renovations for decades. She nearly said no, and then said yes, because the benches had been replaced with the kind Daniel would approve of, and the slides were new, and the rubber mulch was soft, and the ramps made the play structure make sense to children who moved differently. She wore jeans and a white shirt and no title. She stood at a microphone and did not mention her company. She said, "My daughter used her first words at a playground. I think places that hold our children deserve our money and our letters and our labor. We like to say kids are resilient. We should stop saying it like a badge. Resilience means they had to brace against something. Let's be the thing they lean on instead." Afterward, a mother approached with a baby on her hip and a boy with hearing aids and a grin. "Thank you," the mother said, and then added quietly, "The thing about being seen is the part where you aren't also swallowed." Evelyn nodded because she had been swallowed, and spat out by rooms with chandeliers and by headlines with clever knives, and because the woman had said the truth without a preamble. Harper took the boy's hand and led him to the lowest rung and made room beside him with a gesture she had learned from Theo. They climbed, not high, not for long, but together, and when they slid, they landed at the same time and looked at each other like a plan had worked. Evelyn felt Daniel's hand brush hers and let their fingers find the interlocking that carpenters teach apprentices. Let the grain run together, don't force it. Strength lives in the unglamorous face where boards touch. Trouble did not end. The photographer returned with better shoes and a longer lens. Stories sprouted in the places where money grows about whether the CEO's new softness meant weakness, as if compassion and rigor could not share bone. A board member who had once been her mentor invited her to lunch and said with regret, well practiced enough to be art, that the company might outgrow its founder's temperament. Evelyn smiled because she had learned to tell the difference between a warning and a wish, and then she presented 2/4 of results that made the question irrelevant. When he congratulated her, she said, "Thank you. I like what this work is doing to my voice," and watched him try to pretend he did not hear what she meant. Lucas kept 2 weekends and forfeited 3, and tried to move a therapy appointment to accommodate golf, and was told no. He arrived at the playground once with a jacket too expensive for the slide and stood beside the fence like a man at a party with the wrong address. Harper looked at him the way she looked at all things that might require classifying, and then said, "Swing?" He pushed her with the caution of someone accompanied by nervous math. She said, "Higher," and he tried to learn her definition of that word. One evening, after a long day renovated by small good news, Evelyn invited Daniel and Theo for dinner without thinking about what it implied, which is to say because to think first would have been to negotiate with ghosts. She cooked a meal from a recipe card her grandmother had written in looping, bossy script. She burned nothing. She spilled salt and laughed, and did not feel the impulse to hide the mess before it could be judged. After dessert, the maple syrup was Theo's idea, and an absolute victory. Harper brought out her picture book, and one by one named things in a voice edged in satin. Tree, sky, cat. She turned the page. Home. She tapped the drawing of a house with a square door and rounded windows, and then she looked up and pointed, not at a picture but at the table. Home, she said again, and rested her hand on Evelyn's wrist, and then slid it down to Daniel's. Theo leaned his head against her shoulder and found the pulse there as if it were a drum you follow so you don't get lost in a parade. No one spoke for several seconds because it would have been vulgar to fill that kind of silence. When Daniel kissed Evelyn for the first time, it was after the dishes were done and the lights had been turned low, and the soft whir of the dishwasher made the room sound like a boat at anchor. He asked with his mouth near her temple, and his hands gentle enough to be a question, even if he had not asked aloud. And she answered by stepping into him with the certainty of a woman who knows where her weight belongs. The kiss was not cinematic or desperate. It was a promise framed in wood and held together with joinery that would not show from the front because the front was for joy. Stories complicate when they become real. Daniel's ex, Mara, observed their weekends together with the wary grace of a co-parent who had learned to keep her center. She invited Evelyn for coffee one morning with the clear subtext of, "Let's be grown, not perform being grown," and she asked two questions that were knives wrapped in kindness. "Do you love my son?" she said. "Will you love him on the days you don't like me?" Evelyn said yes, and then said yes again, because even the good men in her world had often confused the answers. Mara nodded and said, "All right then, welcome to the team." And Evelyn, who had staffed more teams than she could count, felt a specific relief she had never earned in a conference room. Autumn pulled the park's colors inward. The swings creaked in a lower register. The benches held the day's chill longer. Harper began kindergarten with an aide who spoke in pictures and waited like a saint. On the second Friday, she stood in front of the class and held up the rocket bandage, almost too small for her growing fingers, and said, "This is a medal for trying." The teacher cried after school in her car and didn't tell anyone because sometimes you have to keep a piece of the miracle for yourself. Evelyn's company grew. Ethical growth, the kind that involved hiring more support people instead of treating support as an apology, and her board began using words like durable and culture fit, which made her laugh later in bed with Daniel because she had never wanted to be a fit before. And now the words felt less like a sentence and more like a sofa that two people can nap on without sliding off. She launched a fund to rebuild play spaces in neighborhoods where the benches still splintered into children's palms, and she wrote the checks without press releases and opened the gate on a Saturday morning with a set of keys she'd had cut for herself. Daniel and Theo installed a free library shaped like a tiny blue house. Harper put the first book in, a copy of the one she had used to name the world, and patted the roof twice. "Safe," she said, and the word was a blueprint. On a winter night when the sky made the city's edges crisp, Lucas called, not through lawyers, just a father with his voice thinned by a flu and something else that sounded like recognition. "She told me a joke," he said, and couldn't get through the punchline because he was laughing, and because he needed someone to witness the fact that he had found her humor without asking where she had learned it. "Good," Evelyn said and meant it, and he said thank you, and she said, "Take care of yourself." And when the call ended, she pressed her face into Daniel's shoulder and let the complicated relief pass through her like weather. They married in a building with windows as tall as a summer promise and plants everywhere because Harper believed rooms breathed better that way. Theo wore a tie he hated and an expression he tried to hide. Mara fixed the tie and did not try to fix the expression because she knew which things are worth touching. Priya stood for Evelyn and made a toast about maintenance that made the engineers cheer like a joke had finally landed in a world that always pretended jokes didn't matter. Mason cried openly and then lied about allergies. The ceremony itself was very small and very exact. They promised not to protect each other from the truth. They promised to make repair their default. They promised to build no walls that could not be made doors in 2 moves. Daniel slipped a ring on Evelyn's finger, and she looked at her hand and saw not an adornment but a joint, a place where 2 things met and neither broke. That night, after the dancing and the cake and the final hug from a child who had decided bed was a lie adults tell because they're jealous. They stood on their small back balcony with blankets around their shoulders, and the city moving in the distance like a steady heart. Harper pressed her forehead to the glass and fogged a circle and drew with the absolute concentration of a tiny architect, a rectangle with a triangle on top and a square in the middle, and 2 dots as windows, and then 5 small stick figures holding hands beneath it. She wrote in letters that looked like little ladders the word family. She did not turn to see if they saw. She knew they did. In the spring, when the first warm weekend made the playground smell like sun-warmed rubber and orange peels, they went back to the bench where the world had unlatched. The same bench, sanded now by seasons and by the backs of 100 small legs. They sat. They watched Harper and Theo invent a game where the slide was a river and the mulch was an island, and the rules changed every minute and still made sense. A new father sat near them with a baby asleep against his chest, and the look of a man who had been given a fragile planet to hold. He nodded, Daniel nodded back. Evelyn smiled with the gentleness of someone who no longer needed to make room safe with her credentials. When Harper climbed the ladder, she did not look back. When she got to the top, she called, not loudly, not to the world, just to the people who had built the ground. Watch, she said, and slid into their hands. And the future was not a meeting to be moved, or a headline to outpace, or a threat to negotiate. It was a small person's voice cutting the air and landing in a place that had been made to catch it. Later, when the kids ran for water fountains and the park fell into that tired lull that feels like contentment dressed in grass, Evelyn traced the grain of the bench with her thumb and felt the ridges and the smoother places where touch had done its patient work. "You know," she said, "I used to think love was leverage." "And now?" Daniel asked, his smile a voice he had taught her to hear. "And now it's load-bearing," she said, and he laughed, and the sound joined the scream of swings and the sigh of breeze and the almost inaudible click of a camera far away that would never make the papers because the story it saw refused to be sold. They walked home as the light turned kind and the city forgot to be sharp. Harper swung between them once, then again, then stopped them with the authority of a person who understands the gravity of her own voice. "Mama," she said, "Daddy." She had tried the word on Daniel in private the week before, rolling it in her mouth like a marble and then handing it to him as if it might break. He had cried in the garage and blamed the varnish. She said it now on a sidewalk lined with small trees that would one day be big enough to shade a whole block, and Evelyn felt her heart adjust to the weight, the way a beam adjusts under a new roof. "Yes, love," Evelyn said, and Harper pointed at a window box full of purple flowers. "We need more," she said, decisive as a designer, "for the library, for our porch, for everything." She gestured in a circle that took in the sky. "Beautiful," she declared, and it was impossible to argue. They bought flowers from a corner stand where the man wrapped stems in yesterday's sports section and told them which ones could survive excess love. They carried them home in the late afternoon, each of them holding a portion of the color, and when they reached the porch, Daniel set the box down and turned toward Evelyn with the expression he wore when a joke was too good not to share and too tender to risk. "You realize," he said, "that this is a fortune, right?" "The flowers?" she asked, laughing. "No," he said, "this. The work we would get to do every day that pays us in this." He gestured toward Harper, arranging petals into families, and Theo debating with a bee about air rights. "For a long time I thought I was broke because I couldn't give my kid an amusement park. Turns out I just hadn't learned the currency yet." Evelyn touched his face, thumb along the scar that told the truth better than any resume. "We are obscenely wealthy," she said, and for once the word wealth did not make her guard go up or her math brain sharpen. It felt like a bench. It felt like a rope ladder. It felt like a mouth opening in a patch of sunlight, to say for you, for the first time, and a hand meeting it not with applause, but with a bandage shaped like a rocket. A medal for trying that had become the story of how they lived. And when the evening came down and the porch light clicked on, and the city shifted into its nocturne, they watered the new flowers and wiped the children's hands and wrote their names inside the books they were donating to the little library with the tiny blue roof, and they walked, as a matter of ritual and reverence, to the playground. They sat on the bench one more time, not to conjure a miracle, not to reenact a scene, but to say thank you to a place that had been the first witness. The swings moved in the breeze as if someone had just leapt. From somewhere a siren rose and then faded, and did not find them because they were not where emergencies live anymore. Harper climbed to the top rung and stood a moment, hands on hips, queen of an empire made of mulch and laughter, and she looked at them and shouted, clear as a bell she had rung herself, "Ready?" Daniel cupped his hands. Evelyn held her breath because holding your breath before joy is a superstition she would never surrender. "Ready," they called, and she slid, and they caught her, and the landing was their life, built and rebuilt with tenderness, made steady by promise, rich beyond the math of men who do not know how to count this kind of thing. Ava Sterling took her daughter to the small neighborhood playground because the boardroom had become too loud for a child who didn't speak. The street behind the swing still pulsed with the noon clatter of delivery trucks and espresso machines, but the park itself was a bowl of quiet. There was a blue slide that glinted like a sluice, 2 green swings, a climbing dome, and a rectangle of rubber mulch that gave underneath your shoes, as if it had learned to be gentle. It was Tuesday. It was hot. The city skyline leaned into the summer haze like a wall of mirrors. Ava's driver asked if she wanted him to wait. She shook her head. "We'll be an hour." She said it like a plan because every hour of her life had been a plan since she was 22, because planning was how she'd dragged a software company out of a failing beta and into a portfolio of products that sat on half the world's phones. But as the car slipped away from the curb and the tinted glass took the last ribbon of reflection with it, the plan dissolved into something softer. Her daughter's hand found hers. Tiny, cool despite the heat, 5 years old and mostly silent. Except at night when the nightmares shook language loose into whisper fragments Ava never caught. "Want the swings?" Ava asked. The girl lifted her chin toward the slide, one small, decisive nod, and Ava felt the familiar ache, the one that lived between pride and grief. She didn't say good choice or okay or sweetheart because she had learned to keep her sentences short, to leave space where words frightened her daughter away. She followed the girl to the ladder and hovered a step behind, while small sneakers lifted, tested, lifted again. A wind moved through the leaves like a hush passing from tree to tree. Phones chimed from a nearby bench. Somewhere a siren started far off and stayed far off. On the other side of the playground, a man knelt in the grass with a boy and a plastic helicopter that had lost its rotor cap. The man's hands were strong and inked, knuckles scratched the way someone's get when they measure days by what they build. He had the kind of beard you either commit to or don't bother with, dark eyes, a sunburned nose. His T-shirt said Rivera and Sons, even though there was only one son here, and the man couldn't be more than mid-30s. He twisted a green zip tie into a makeshift pin, laughed when the boy declared it a surgery, and when the copter whirred again, he lifted it into a slow, careful takeoff that respected airspace and imagination equally. Ava noticed him because she noticed everything now. She noticed the way the boy mirrored the man's breath, how they counted together without saying numbers. She noticed that the man looked at the boy, not at his phone, which in this city was rarer than honesty. She noticed that he registered her and her daughter, and then unregistered them, turning back to his kid with that unfaked attention that is love without performance. She felt the quick, irrational flare of resentment she sometimes felt when she saw parents whose children answered back, even with nonsense, even with stubbornness. The slide spat her daughter into sunlight. Ava caught her under the armpits, and the girl's mouth made a shape for a word that never came. Then the shape vanished, and the girl wriggled free and ran for the dome. Ava let her run. Today she had promised herself she would not be the executive of her child's quiet. She would watch. She would follow. She would keep the panic at a low simmer beneath her ribs instead of boiling over into "try again and say it with me," and all the ruinous, well-meant things. When the girl tripped on the rubber edge of the dome and went down on both palms, she didn't cry. She crawled forward like a small, determined machine and tried again. A ribbon of blood appeared on the heel of one hand. Ava knelt with a napkin, pressed gently, watched the tiny pulse of red slow. "It's okay," she murmured. "It's just a little scrape." The girl pulled back the hand, looked at her own blood with clinical interest, then turned toward the bench with the man and boy. The helicopter had landed. The boy was clapping. The man saw the blood instantly. "You good there?" he called, not too loud. He had a voice that could lift or lower itself, depending on what a child needed. He held up a little bottle of water and a fabric bandage from a pocket that had seen drywall dust and melted crayon. Ava felt herself bristle. She had a Swiss leather bag that cost more than most used cars, and it contained an entire first aid kit and half a pharmacy. She was not a woman who needed help in any category. But her daughter had already crossed to the bench with the quiet, purposeful gait of someone who had decided the world might give her something worthwhile if she stepped into it without permission. The man didn't reach for her. He placed the bandage and water on the bench. "Permission to sit?" he asked the girl, and the absurdity of asking a 5-year-old for permission in a city that seldom asked anyone for permission made something fragile in Ava loosen by a degree. The girl sat. He waited. "Can I tell you what I see?" he asked. The girl watched his hands. He pointed at his own palm, mimed a small drumbeat with 2 fingers, then pointed at the girl's scraped hand and glanced toward her eyes like the answer might live there if he didn't scare it away. "Brave," the boy said solemnly. The boy's name, it turned out, was Mateo. The man's name was Eli, short for Elias, full for "My mother wanted something strong, but easy to yell from the porch." He held a folded paper towel like a flag of truce. The girl reached for it. He didn't move to help. He let her press. He nodded. He didn't look at Ava until the girl finished and slid the bandage across her own skin with imperfect precision. "Nice work," he said to the girl. "Do you like helicopters?" He made his voice smaller, like a secret had climbed inside it. The girl's eyes flicked to the toy. The rotor wobbled. Eli flicked it once with a finger, and it spun true. Mateo grinned. "This one's a flyer. We could run it on a mission if you're into missions." The girl looked at the helicopter as if a door had opened in it. Then she looked at Ava, a quick interrogative glance that meant, "Say yes for me," without saying anything. Ava nodded. The girl stood, wiped her hands on her shorts in the precise way Ava did after getting off a plane, picked up the helicopter carefully, and held it as if carrying a sleeping sparrow. They crossed to the open patch of grass. Eli kept a 2-step distance like men who teach, not men who encroach. Ava followed because her body had learned the choreography of proximity and protection since the day doctors said, "It's not that she can't speak, it's that she doesn't." The words had drilled a hole in her calendar, and in the next 3 years, Ava had filled the hole with everything money could buy: therapy, specialists, devices that turned symbols into sounds, except time. She had never found enough of that. "Okay," Eli said. "We have a pilot, we have a medic, and we have a ground crew." He looked at Mateo. "What's the mission?" Mateo shaded his eyes and gazed toward the blue slide like it was a canyon. "Rescue the sloth," he said. "He's trapped at the top of Mount Slide." "There's a sloth now?" Eli asked. "Obviously." The girl clutched the helicopter. Eli dipped his head. "Pilot, what's our call sign?" The girl's mouth made that shape again, the one Ava had memorized and courted and failed to coax into sound. The girl looked at the helicopter as if it could answer for her. Eli waited, and the waiting didn't feel like pressure. It felt like space. He touched the rotor gently, and the blades whispered. "Sometimes pilots use colors," he offered. or animals, or something true like your favorite sound. The girl inhaled. The city softened everything, but Ava felt the inhalation like weather changing. The girl looked at the slanted sunlight on the slide. She looked at the helicopter's green body and the bandage on her hand that matched the pale beige of the rubber mulch. "Green," she said. Ava didn't realize she had stopped breathing until she heard her own breath crash back into her like a wave hitting a seawall. The word arrived like a pebble dropped in a lake. Small. Perfect. A circle of shock and joy widened out from it in concentric rings. The girl held the helicopter higher. Eli didn't startle. He didn't say, "You spoke." He didn't look at Ava with the awkward triumph of a stranger who had wandered into a miracle. He just nodded and said, "Copy, Green. Mission is a go." They flew. They navigated imaginary crosswinds near the sandbox. They threaded danger between two toddlers who had joined the ground crew with serious expressions and purple popsicles. Eli made sound effects with a restraint that told Ava he knew exactly when noise becomes overwhelm. He kept his words scarce and useful. He let silence do part of the work. When Mateo declared the sloth rescued and the helicopter completed a slow victory orbit of the slide, the girl brought it back and placed it in Eli's hands, like returning a borrowed compass. She didn't look at Ava, she looked at Eli's hands. Then she turned to the water fountain and watched the arc of water spin out like a silver rope. She stood on tiptoe. She didn't reach for the button. She waited again. "Want a boost?" Eli asked. She nodded. He lifted her under the ribs and she drank, and when he set her down, she stayed close to him, but not clinging. Mateo announced the post-mission debrief would happen under the shade of the sycamore, and Eli accepted like an officer receiving orders from a general whose uniform included grass-stained knees. Ava followed. She was grateful for sunglasses because something raw was happening to her face. She did not trust herself to manage it in public. She sat on the grass. The heat came up through the ground, and it felt like the city itself was alive under them, pulsing with people who had no idea this patch of quiet existed or that a word had been born here. "Thank you," she said, when she could say it without breaking. Eli looked at her like a man who has learned to take thanks without claiming the story behind it. "He likes helicopters," he said, nodding at Mateo, "and I've learned that some things lift easier with an excuse." His eyes glanced toward the girl, then back to Ava. "She has a pilot's hands." Ava laughed, and the laugh came out more watery than she'd intended. "She hasn't—" She stopped. She was not practiced in saying the thing out loud. Success had trained her to compress everything vulnerable into numbers and charts and plans. That's her first word in front of someone who isn't me. He understood it like you understand weather. "Then I'm honored," he said, and the word honored landed better than wow would have, or any other exclamation. "Do you—" Ava began and stopped again. "What do you do?" "Contractor," he said. "Mostly small residential. Kitchens, doors, repairs, whatever people need to make their houses easier to love. You?" There was always a moment when someone learned who she was. The micro recalibration, the calculation flickering behind the eyes, the sense of who had the power in a conversation shifting in one direction or the other. "I run a company," she said, and heard herself choose the smallest version of the truth. "What kind?" His tone was not the tone of a person filming a story to send to a group chat labeled "Famous People I Met by Accident." "Tech," she said, and almost left it there. Then she added, "Sterling Labs." He did not blink. Then he blinked. "The one with the attention app that lets you mute the rest of your phone?" "That one," she said, "among others." He whistled softly. "I owe you a month of good sleep. That app saved our mornings for a while." She wanted to tell him the app had saved hers too, at a price nobody saw. She wanted to say she had built something to stop the world from shouting, and still she could not find a soft place for her daughter's silence to be safe. Instead, she said, "Glad it helped." Mateo handed the helicopter to the girl with a solemn ceremony. "You can borrow it another day. We'll do a night mission." Eli raised an eyebrow. If the pilot's mom approves. Ava found herself nodding as if minutes had become a currency she could spend more freely than money. "We could come back," she said. "Same time tomorrow?" The girl glanced up at her like she'd been offered a promotion with unlimited snacks. She looked at Eli. Eli smiled like a promise he knew not to make too loudly. "We'll be here." They came back. Not just the next day, but the next 6. The routine grew like a vine across the fence line of Ava's life, curling around 2 p.m. and pulling it gently out of her calendar. Her assistant learned to say, "She has an off-site then," and for the first time in years, Ava watched an hour hold its ground. She began measuring days by how much sun touched the slide and whether the sycamore showed more of its pale underleaves when the wind came. She learned Eli knew 3 ways to quiet a scared dog and 5 ways to coax a stubborn window sash back into its track without breaking it. He learned that Ava knew how to rebuild a software roadmap like a surgeon repairing a tendon, delicate and decisive, and that she slipped into the role of boss like other people slipped into a sweater. It looked soft from a distance, and then you noticed the stitching and realized how strong it was. He learned about the girl's hospital files only because Ava sighed one Tuesday when the city smelled like hot metal and said, "I keep a ledger in my head and the numbers don't add up." He asked which numbers. She said, "Hours of therapy versus words," and then pressed a hand to her eyes as if embarrassed by the math of motherhood. He didn't tell her to trust the process or to let go or to try harder. He said, "Maybe it's not that kind of ledger. Maybe the units are wrong." When she looked at him like he'd picked a lock, he shrugged. "I'm a contractor. If you measure a wall in inches when it was meant to be measured in centimeters, the whole room ends up angry." On the 7th day, they were partway through a mission to retrieve a missing moon rock, one chipped piece of gray tile hidden under the bench by Mateo. When a woman in a black dress and sharper heels than any playground had reason to accommodate clicked across the rubber surface and said Ava's name. She had the look of someone who sent emails with 2 bullet points and a deadline that had already passed. "Vivian," Ava said, standing, "you're not a playground person." Vivian smiled without heat. "No, but I am a board person, and the board is in a situation." She shifted her bag slightly, a gesture that made the light glance off a gold watch face. "Morgan published?" Ava exhaled through her teeth. Someone had switched the city noise back on. Of course he did. Eli looked at her without asking. He looked at the girl, and at Mateo, and at the helicopter that had learned their hands, and he understood that whatever the situation was, it would try to take this hour away if he let it. He touched Ava's elbow like docking a boat. "We can watch them," he said quietly. "Take the call. We'll be here when you come back." She wanted to say it could wait. She wanted to be the kind of person who believed an hour would still be waiting after a fire. But she knew this fire. Morgan lived for them. He was the co-founder whose vision had once matched hers until ambition split into forks, and his took the path that cut corners. He was the reason she sometimes dreamt in lawsuits. He had wanted to pivot the company in a direction that monetized not attention but anxiety. She had blocked it. He had left with a handshake and a non-disparagement clause and a smile that meant he had banked a different kind of currency. 15 minutes, she said to Eli. "If I'm longer, please walk her home. It's 2 blocks. He nodded. "We'll time a loop around the block for exactly 15. Vivian fell into step with Ava toward the gate. "We need to draft a response. His post accuses you of valuing privacy over profit," Ava said. "Yes, that's accurate." "Of negligence toward shareholders." "That part isn't." "The market won't parse nuance in the hour before close." Vivian's voice stayed calm. "We need to be loud or be late." Ava's phone lit with messages. Legal, PR, board, journalists. The push and pull of her other life yanked at her like a rip current. She hated it for how good she was at it. "Draft this," she said, already moving into a cadence that had made senators and VCs and union reps blink and step backward. We agree that privacy and long-term trust are not traded for short-term profit. Our data is clean. Our roadmap is measured in years, not in quarters. That's how we outlast the men who mistake volume for value and remind the market that Morgan's last pivot crashed a company with a similar claim. Do you want soft language? I want honest language. Honest is not always soft. That's the point. Vivian nodded, fingers already moving. And your personal statement? Ava stopped at the gate. The green paint flaked under her hand and stuck to her palm like the kind of confetti nobody celebrates. She looked at her daughter. The girl stood with Mateo at the base of the slide, listening to Eli outline a night mission that involved glow sticks and the moon as a willing accomplice. The girl's head tilted, the way it did when sound fit in her rather than pressed against her. My personal statement, Ava said, is that I'm in a park for 15 minutes and I'm not available. 15, Vivian repeated. I'll run interference. Ava took the call on the bench outside the gate where she could see the sycamore shadow moving like an old clock. She used words that had carried her through congressional hearings and IPOs, and while Vivian mapped the sentence that would calm the investors without feeding the man who had lit the match, Ava watched her daughter raise a hand to the helicopter and whisper a phrase that made Mateo nod solemnly, like a command had been issued and understood. She watched Eli's shoulders slope a fraction when the girl made a second word, two syllables that sounded like again, but might have been begin, the city's noise snagging the middle. When she ended the call, she felt empty and full at once. She walked back through the gate. Eli met her with the kind of glance that says, "How's the weather where you went?" She smiled because the storm had moved to the far side of the horizon. "I'm here," she said, and meant it. The crisis didn't end there. Posts multiplied like a rumor of rain. Share price dipped, then steadied. The next day there were cameras outside headquarters. The day after that a lawsuit arrived like a poorly wrapped gift. But the hour in the park held. Eli bent his days around it without making a speech. Sometimes he came in paint-splattered jeans and a clean shirt. Sometimes he came in clean jeans and paint on his forearms. Sometimes he came with a length of wood balanced on his shoulder and left it leaning against the fence while he choreographed a rescue mission that turned into a counting exercise, that turned into a word no one expected. A week into the crisis, Ava's ex-husband resurfaced like a ship that had only pretended to sink. He was a venture capitalist with champagne opinions about merit and risk, a man who had once told her she was too loud in your quiet, and then asked for an equity slice because marriage should be a portfolio of mutual leverage. He had remarried. He had a baby who fit his Instagram the way suits fit him, tailored and borrowed. He sent an email that said we should revisit custody given the instability, and Ava's lawyer sent a reply that made the word revisit sound like a door closing. When he showed up at the playground gate with a smile that wouldn't pass a crash test, Eli clocked him instantly. It wasn't the suit or the watch. It was the way the man looked at the playground like it was a set in a commercial. The way he said hi like he remembered the names of waiters. The way his eyes slid over the girl and landed on Ava with that glittering curiosity people reserve for things they can't own. "Oliver," Ava said, and the syllables made Eli understand more than any introduction could. "Viv said you've been hard to reach," Oliver said, as if it were charming. He glanced toward Eli. "Friend?" "A neighbor," Eli said easily. He didn't offer his hand. He didn't step back. He held his ground the way a good frame holds a door. "We're on a mission? They're flying." Oliver laughed, but his eyes didn't. "I bet. Ava, we should be adults about this. You're under a lot of pressure. Investors are rattled. It's not the best environment for—" "Don't," Ava said gently, and the gentleness made the word hit harder. "Don't finish that sentence." His jaw tightened an eighth of an inch. "I'm saying maybe I should take her for a few days. Let you focus. Your company needs you." "She needs me more." Oliver's gaze flicked to Eli again. "And this is part of your plan?" "I'm learning to have hours that don't belong to the market," Ava said. "It's new. It's working." The girl had paused at the top of the slide. She watched the men the way a cat watches a door. Eli noticed and lifted a hand. "Green, we have a go," he said lightly. The girl slid and landed and ran to him and placed a small pebble in his palm like a medal. Oliver hid his surprise, but not well. "She talks now?" he asked, and something mean skated under the words, the kind of disbelief that pretends to be curiosity and is actually custody. "She speaks when she wants," Ava said, "like everyone else." Oliver's smile went glassy. "I'll be in touch," he said and left, with the kind of turn that makes jackets whisper. Eli didn't comment. He placed the pebble on the bench and pushed the helicopter into a slow circle. "Green," he said softly, "what's our heading?" "Home," the girl said, and Ava swallowed a noise that might have been a laugh or a sob or something old leaving. After Oliver's visit, Ava's fear found new shapes in the dark. She had never been in the business of wanting something she could not buy or negotiate for. Now she wanted hours. She wanted a flock of them daily, wild and gentle. She wanted her daughter's words to come like birds, slow at first, then in small migratory bursts. She wanted the kind of ordinary that looks boring on paper and feels like breath in a room. Eli became part of that ordinary without announcement. He fixed a cabinet hinge in Ava's kitchen after it started sighing in the night. He taught Mateo how to wipe a brush so paint dries like truth, even. He found a way to quiet the front door so it stopped snapping shut like a reprimand. He stood next to Ava on a sidewalk the day cameras followed her to work and leaned just enough that his shoulder touched her sleeve once, briefly, and the tiny static jolt felt like someone had plugged her back into a power source that wasn't adrenaline.